Chicago night poured down sleet and rain, as if it meant to chase every lost soul off the streets. Outside Obsidian, the most exclusive restaurant in West Loop, warm, golden light spilled onto the frozen sidewalk like a cruel joke aimed at anyone who couldn't afford to step through those glass doors. The security guard in a black suit was about to shoo the child away when he stopped. In the corner of the wall, a few steps from the entrance, a little boy stood huddled. He couldn't have been more than 6. A thin sweater with holes at the elbows clung to a frail, trembling frame. No coat, barefoot on the frozen, slushy pavement. Dark brown hair unevenly cut, matted against a pale forehead. On his left cheek, near his eye, was a fresh mark of his struggles. In his tiny hands, purple from the cold, he clutched a worn stuffed bear. Its ear was torn, its fur matted with age, as if it were the only thing he had left in the world. Large brown eyes, deep and ancient, looked up at the security guard. Not with fear, only with the resignation of a child who had grown too used to being turned away. The guard raised his hand to wave him off, but the little boy didn't ask for money, didn't ask for food, didn't cry or beg. He only asked one question, his voice a whisper, trembling from the cold. "Mister, do you know anyone who wants a little boy?" The guard blinked. His hand froze in midair. The little boy lowered his head, his voice growing smaller, as if speaking to himself. "I promise I'll be good. I know how to wash dishes. I know how to mop floors. I don't eat much. I just need a place where I can feel safe." Those words didn't sound rehearsed. They were clumsy, broken, like a child trying to explain his own worth through the chores he could do, as if he had grown used to asking permission to exist. Just then, a sleek black Maybach glided to the curb and stopped. The door opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, long black overcoat, dark hair with streaks of early gray at the temples, wet with sleet. A faint scar ran from the corner of his jaw down to his neck. Steel gray eyes swept the sidewalk with the automatic habit of someone used to controlling everything within his sight. Everett Ashford, owner of Obsidian, ruler of half of Chicago's underworld, and things that no one dared to mention. They called him the Black King. He was about to walk straight inside, but then his eyes caught the little boy. The child stared back, unblinking, unflinching. The stuffed bear clutched tight, his purple lips trembling, rain or tears streaming down his cheek, running over the mark on his cheek. Everett stopped. The man that Chicago's underworld feared. The man whose single nod could decide the fate of others. The man who had never forgiven anyone who betrayed him, stood frozen before a 6-year-old boy standing barefoot in the snow. And then he did something no one expected. He slowly crouched down. One knee touched the frozen pavement, until his eyes were level with the child's deep brown ones. "What's your name, little one?" His voice softened without meaning to, as if someone had flipped a switch and silenced the predator inside him. The little boy didn't answer immediately. He looked at the man for a long time, with eyes far too old for his age, the eyes of a child who had learned to read adults to survive. Then he tilted his head. "Noah," he answered, his voice a whisper. "But no one ever wants to know my name." Everett said nothing. Something flickered in his eyes, so fast that even Reed standing behind him didn't have time to notice. Perhaps it was rage. Perhaps it was old pain. Perhaps it was the shadow of another little boy, the one he had lost 18 years ago at almost this age. "I want to know," he said, his voice rough. Noah blinked, as if that was the strangest thing he had ever heard. "Why?" Everett didn't answer. He simply removed his black overcoat, a coat worth more than most people's monthly rent, and draped it over the boy's bony shoulders. Noah flinched, a painful reflex of a child who had forgotten what kindness felt like. Everett paused. Didn't push, didn't rush. He simply let the coat rest on the boy's shoulders, then stood. He turned to Reed, his most trusted man, who had followed him for 18 years. His voice returned to its usual chill, but underneath was something else. Something Reed had never heard in 18 years. "Bring him inside. Call the doctor. Now." Reed nodded, didn't ask. In all his years of loyal service, he had never seen his boss kneel before anyone. Never seen him give his coat to anyone. Never seen him look at anyone with those eyes. Tonight, everything had changed. Because of a 6-year-old boy barefoot in the snow, clutching a torn stuffed bear, asking a question no child should ever have to ask. "Do you know anyone who wants a little boy?" If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story. Reed held the glass door open, and the warmth from inside spilled out like an invisible wall. So sharply different, it was almost suffocating compared to the skin-cutting cold outside. Noah stood on the threshold, his bare feet numb from the snow, hesitating on the black velvet mat. The boy looked down, looked at his dirty feet, then looked at the bright, glossy white marble floor inside. "I'll dirty the floor." His voice was tiny, nearly swallowed by the sleet behind him. Reed blinked. Nearly 2 decades at Everett Ashford's side, he'd seen more than enough of the world. But that sentence, from a 6-year-old, tightened something in his chest in a way he hadn't expected. "The floor can be cleaned." Reed lowered his voice, gentler than even he was surprised to hear. "Come in. You'll freeze to death out here." Noah lifted his gaze to him, those old brown eyes searching, weighing. Then the boy stepped inside. But not in an ordinary way. Noah moved on tiptoe, each step placed so lightly it was almost soundless, as if he'd learned how to move without letting anyone know he existed. Everett's black coat was far too big for his gaunt little body, the hem dragging along the floor like a cloak, with only the old, battered teddy bear jutting out from where the boy clutched it tight against his chest. Obsidian on a Friday night was never quiet. Crystal chandeliers poured a honeyed gold over banquet tables draped in white linen. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. The air carried a faint trace of truffle oil, aged wine, and money, the kind of money that didn't need to show off. But now, everything stopped. Heads turned one after another. Waiters froze mid-step. A sommelier went still with a bottle lifted halfway. Guests in designer suits and silk dresses stared at the strange little procession. A large man in a black suit, leading a thin child wrapped in a coat that cost more than many people's cars, leaving wet footprints on pristine marble. Whispers spread through the room like wind moving through dry leaves. "What is that? Is that a homeless kid? Why is he here? Reed just brought a street kid into Obsidian?" Noah heard it, every word. His shoulders drew in, his head dipping lower. He tried to make himself smaller, as if he could disappear into the enormous coat, but he kept walking, one silent tiptoed step after another, each step like an apology for his own existence. Margaret Cole stopped them in the middle of the dining room. The manager was a tall woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed, sharper-mouthed, with graying hair pulled into a strict bun. She'd worked at Obsidian for 7 years and trusted no one who hadn't proven their worth. This child hadn't proven anything. Reed. Maggie's voice was clipped, professional, but her eyes stayed fixed on Noah with undisguised irritation. "What exactly is going on? We're full tonight. VIPs in the private room. You can't—" "Step aside, Maggie." The voice came from behind them. Everett Ashford walked through the door. Sleet still clung to his black hair, and his white shirt was wet against his shoulders. No coat. And somehow he looked even more dangerous, like a blade freshly drawn from its sheath. Maggie turned to face him, her mouth opening to protest. Everett looked at her. Just looked. One single look, cold, level, the kind of look that had made grown men reconsider the choices of their lives. Maggie's mouth closed. She stepped aside. No one dared ask another question. The staircase in the back led up to the 2nd floor, where Everett kept a private room that few people were ever allowed to enter. Reed led the way, and Noah followed behind, every step still as light as air, the black coat dragging over each stair. Everett came last, his eyes never leaving the small, trembling figure ahead. The VIP room opened like another world. Soft golden light spilled from the wall lamps, warm and gentle. A black velvet sofa ran along the wall, a dark oak table, a thick plush rug underfoot. An electric fireplace breathed out a mild heat, driving off the cold that still clung to the boy. Noah stood in the middle of the room, motionless. He didn't sit down even though the sofa was right beside him. He didn't touch anything, even though his hands were shaking from the cold. He only stood there, hunched inside the enormous coat, brown eyes sweeping over the room with the wary look of a small animal that had wandered into unfamiliar territory. Buddy was held tighter than ever, as if the old, worn teddy bear was the only thing in the world he trusted. 15 minutes later, a soft knock sounded at the door. A woman stepped in, brown hair neatly tied back at the nape of her neck, kind eyes behind slender-framed glasses, a medical bag in her hand. Prate Economo, Rachel Winters, the private physician Everett trusted, the only one he called when he needed absolute discretion. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Everett said, his voice low. Rachel nodded, then turned her gaze to the boy standing in the middle of the room. Her professional eyes moved over each detail, and her face paled by degrees, even as she tried to keep her composure. She walked closer, lowered herself to Noah's level, her voice light as a feather. "Hello, my name is Rachel. I'm a doctor. Can I examine you for a moment?" Noah backed away one step, shoulders going rigid, his arms tightening around Buddy until his knuckles turned white. His brown eyes widened, not in pure fear, but in a vigilance sunk deep into bone. He didn't speak, only shook his head without quite realizing it, then took another step back. Everett watched, then slowly moved to Noah's side. He didn't touch the boy, didn't reach for him, only sat down nearby, his back against the sofa arm, close enough for Noah to feel his presence, but not close enough to threaten him. "No one's going to hurt you here," Everett said, his voice low and steady. "You have my word." Noah turned to look at him. Those two old eyes held Everett's gray gaze, searching, judging, weighing. A 6-year-old shouldn't have eyes like that, the eyes of someone who'd learned to read adults in order to survive. The silence stretched. Then Noah nodded, very slightly, almost invisible. He didn't let go of Buddy, but he allowed Rachel to come closer. The examination happened in silence. Rachel checked every mark, every shadow of his past, her hands professional but faintly trembling when she saw what lay beneath the thin shirt. She took his blood pressure, checked his eyes, ears, throat, and wrote in her notebook with handwriting that grew more hurried by the minute. Noah sat as still as a statue, only pressing his lips together when Rachel touched the places that hurt. But he didn't cry, didn't make a sound, as if he was far too used to enduring in silence. When she finished, Rachel draped a thin blanket over Noah, gently patted the boy's head with a small smile, then signaled Everett to step out into the hallway. She closed the door, leaving Noah inside with Reed standing guard. Out in the hall, Rachel turned to Everett, and her face had lost all its professional calm. Her gentle eyes were filled now with pain and fury. "He is so weak and neglected," she said, her voice thick. "This boy hasn't been properly fed for a very long time. Old injuries layered over new ones, evidence of a long, dark past written on his small body. The marks told a story of neglect that no child should ever endure." She stopped, drew a deep breath. "This child has been living in hell, Mr. Ashford. At least 2 years." Everett didn't say anything. He didn't need to. In his eyes, a cold fire flared, smoldering, lethal. It wasn't the anger of an ordinary man. It was the anger of the Black King, the man who ruled half of Chicago, the man whose single nod could decide the fate of anyone. Everett went back into the room, his face giving away nothing of what he'd just heard. He called down to the kitchen, his tone clipped, then sat in the chair across from Noah, keeping just enough distance. The boy still sat motionless on the sofa, curled under the thin blanket Rachel had laid over him. Buddy clutched tight in his arms, brown eyes tracking Everett's every movement with unbroken vigilance. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Giuseppe Benedetti stepped in, the head chef of Obsidian, an Italian man in his 50s with hands roughened by knives and fire and a heart softer than any dessert he'd ever made. In his hands was a silver tray, steam rising from a bowl of golden chicken soup. Beside it, a plate of soft bread cut into small pieces, and a glass of warm milk. Joey saw the boy, and it felt as if someone had squeezed his heart in a fist. The child was so thin he seemed almost translucent, the dark mark on his cheek, eyes too large for his hollowed face. Joey had seen many things in his life, had lived through hard years in Naples before coming to America, but the sight of a child like this still made him want to cry. But Joey was a professional. He swallowed the ache, put on the warmest smile he could manage, and stepped forward to set the tray on the small table in front of Noah. "Here you go," he said, his Italian accent making the words sound gentler. "Chicken soup, my grandmother's recipe. Good for someone who's cold." Noah looked at the food. His brown eyes widened, his nose drawing in the rich, fragrant smell. He swallowed, his throat moving visibly. But he didn't touch it. His arms stayed wrapped around Buddy. He didn't reach for the spoon, didn't take the bread, only stared. Then the boy's eyes flicked to Everett. A quick glance, almost furtive. Then back to the food. Then another glance at Everett, as if he were waiting for something. Everett understood immediately, and that understanding cut into his chest like a blade. The boy was waiting for permission. This child had been taught that eating without being allowed was a sin, that food wasn't his right, that he had to ask to be kept alive. Everett leaned forward, his voice gentle but clear. "This is yours, Noah. You're allowed to eat." Noah watched him for another moment, as if waiting for the trap, waiting for the next words to be but or if. When they didn't come, the boy slowly reached out and took the spoon in hands that were still trembling. He scooped a spoonful of soup, small, very small, lifted it to his mouth, tasted it. Something flickered in his brown eyes, maybe surprise, maybe a pleasure he'd forgotten so long ago he no longer knew its name. Then he ate again, one spoonful at a time, slow, careful. Every movement looked measured, as if eating too fast would earn punishment, as if the bowl might be snatched away at any moment. Joey stood nearby, his heart tightening with every beat as he watched the way the child ate, not the way a hungry child eats, the way a small animal eats when it knows the food can be stolen. Suddenly, Noah stopped. The spoon froze in midair. He looked down at the bowl, now half empty, then lifted his gaze to Everett, panic flooding his eyes. "I ate too much, didn't I?" His voice shook. I'm sorry. He set the spoon down, pushed the bowl away, and folded in on himself as if bracing for a blow. "I didn't mean to. I won't eat anymore. Please don't." Everett felt the rage inside him surge, not at the child, but at whoever had taught him to apologize for eating. But he kept his face calm, kept his voice steady, because this boy didn't need any more anger, even if it wasn't aimed at him. "You haven't eaten enough," Everett said, sliding the bowl back in front of Noah. "Keep eating." Noah stared at him, his brown eyes full of confusion. He didn't understand. He didn't understand why this grown man wasn't angry. He didn't understand why there was no blow coming. He didn't understand what rules this world was running on, but he picked up the spoon, and he kept eating, one spoonful at a time, until the bowl was wiped clean, until the plate of bread was gone, until the glass of milk was drained to the last drop. For the first time in 2 years, the boy was allowed to eat until he was full. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't punished for eating. Noah looked up at Everett with bewildered eyes, as if trying to decode a new language, a new world he'd never known existed. It was late. The restaurant was slowly emptying out, and Everett made a decision without needing to think for long. The boy would stay at Obsidian tonight. He couldn't send a 6-year-old back to the street in a night of sleet, couldn't hand him over to social services at midnight, and if he was honest, Everett didn't want to take his eyes off this child. A small room behind the office area was cleared out quickly. Maggie changed the sheets herself, laid out extra thick blankets, and turned on a small nightlight that cast a soft golden glow. The room wasn't large, but it was cozy, with a window looking out onto the quiet alley behind, a small wooden wardrobe, and an old but comfortable armchair in the corner. Noah stood on the threshold, staring into the room the way you'd stare at an unfamiliar world. His brown eyes stopped on the bed, the spotless white sheets, the puffed, soft quilt, the fluffy white pillows. He looked at the bed as if it were an object from another planet, as if he didn't understand what it was for, or more precisely, didn't believe it was meant for him. "The bed is yours," Everett said, standing behind him. Noah didn't react right away. He kept looking at the bed for a few more seconds, then slowly shook his head. Without a word, he stepped back, walked around the bed, and sought refuge in the shadows, where the walls met and made a hidden angle. Then he sat down on the floor, pulled his knees to his chest, hugged Buddy close, and curled into a small ball. Everett stood still, watching. The boy didn't choose the soft bed. He chose the cold corner. He chose the hard floor. He chose the place where he could see the entire room and the door, like a small animal choosing a den to hide in. Everett didn't force him. He didn't pull him onto the bed. He didn't explain that the floor was cold and he'd get sick. He only took a blanket from the bed, walked over, and laid it gently over Noah without touching him. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," he said, then stepped out and pulled the door mostly closed, leaving a small crack for the hallway light to spill through. Everett sat in the office next door, trying to handle paperwork but unable to focus. His mind kept circling back to the little room, to the boy huddled against the wall, to what Rachel had said. Hell, at least 2 years. Who had done this to a child? A sound pulled him from his thoughts, soft, very soft, almost impossible to hear. But in the stillness of late night, it was as clear as a bell. Everett stood, moved quickly to the small room, and pushed the door open. Noah shrank into the smallest space he could find, but he was shaking violently. His eyes were squeezed shut, his face twisted in pain, his mouth moving around words that made no sound. A nightmare, but there was no crying, no screaming. He was living through the nightmare in almost absolute silence, and Everett understood, with a painful clarity, that this wasn't natural silence. This was learned silence, taught silence, conditioned into him until it became instinct. The boy had learned not to cry out loud, learned not to make noise, learned to endure nightmares alone without bothering anyone, because he was used to suffering in silence. Everett didn't know what to do. He'd faced the most dangerous enemies in Chicago, had made life and death decisions, had built an empire with his bare hands, but standing in front of a 6-year-old trembling in a nightmare, he was completely helpless. In the end, he did the only thing he could think of. He sat down on the floor beside Noah without touching him, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out in front of him, silent, waiting. Minutes passed. Noah's shaking slowly eased, his breathing slowed. Then his brown eyes opened, hazy with sleep and fear. He saw Everett sitting there, not standing over him, not reaching out to hit him, just sitting, quiet, level with him. Noah didn't say anything. He didn't ask. He didn't cry. He only looked at Everett for a long time, then slowly, very slowly, leaned to the side, rested his head against Everett's arm, his hands still wrapped tight around Buddy, and he fell asleep. Everett didn't move for the rest of that night. He didn't dare shift, afraid he'd wake the boy. He didn't dare breathe too hard, afraid he'd startle him. His arm went numb, his back ached from sitting on the hard floor, but he didn't budge. Outside the window, Chicago kept spilling sleet, wind shrieking between the tall buildings, a winter night cold enough to cut to the bone. But in this small room, with the warmth of a child leaning against him, Everett felt something changing, in the boy, and in himself. The pale gray light of a Chicago morning slipped through the window, carrying the leftover chill from the night of sleet. Noah opened his eyes, brown eyes blinking a few times, confused. He looked around the unfamiliar room, at the white wall, at the bed he hadn't slept in, at the blanket over him that he didn't remember pulling up. Then he saw Everett. The man was sitting in the armchair in the corner, a cup of coffee in his hand, the steam long gone. He was still wearing last night's suit, his shirt wrinkled, his hair slightly mussed, but his eyes were alert, as if he'd been awake all night. "Good morning, Noah." Everett's voice was low and gentle. Noah sat up slowly, his back still pressed into the corner, his arms tight around Buddy against his chest. He didn't answer, only watched Everett with that familiar, evaluating stare, as if trying to guess what this adult wanted from him, as if waiting for what would happen next. Everett didn't hurry. He took a sip of cold coffee, then set the cup down on the small table beside him. His gaze settled on the old teddy bear in Noah's hands, the fur worn and faded, an ear torn, the plastic eyes scratched, yet held like the most precious treasure in the world. "Does your bear have a name?" Everett asked, as casually as if he were asking about the weather. Noah looked down at Buddy, his small fingers unconsciously stroking the old fur. Silence stretched for a few seconds. Then the boy spoke, his voice so quiet it sounded like he was afraid someone might hear. "Buddy. My dad gave him to me." Everett didn't say anything, only waited. And that silent waiting, not pushing, not pressing, seemed to make Noah feel safe enough to continue. "Before Dad and Mom went far away," the boy's voice grew even smaller. "They said they went to heaven. There was a car, and a red light, and sirens. I don't remember clearly. I only remember there were lots of police. And then someone took me to Aunt Brenda's house." He stopped, hugging Buddy tighter. Buddy is the only thing I have left from Dad." He didn't need to say more. He didn't need to explain what happened at Aunt Brenda's house. The shadow on his cheek, his fragile, hollow frame, the way he flinched when someone came too close. All of it had already said enough. Everett looked at the boy, at the torn teddy bear, and something in his chest tightened with a painful grip. An orphaned child, with nothing to his name but an old teddy bear and scars on his body. A soft knock sounded at the door. Reed stepped in, his face more severe than usual, a thin stack of papers in his hand. He looked at Noah, then at Everett, signaling that he wanted to speak privately. Everett stood. "Sit here. I'll be right back," he told Noah, then stepped out into the hallway with Reed and pulled the door closed. "I found the information," Reed said, his voice low. "Noah Carter, 6 years old. His parents died in a traffic accident 2 years ago, hit head-on by a truck that ran a red light. The boy was the only survivor, in the back seat. He turned a page. After that, the boy was placed with his legal guardian, Brenda Holt, his maternal aunt, his mother's sister, and her husband, Warren Holt. What else? Everett asked, his voice even, but his eyes had darkened. Reed hesitated for a second. I checked every record. There's no missing person report filed for the boy. No one called the police. No one searched. A heavy silence settled over the hallway. Everett looked at Reed, his eyes cold as steel, as ice, as the Chicago winter outside. No one filed a missing person report? His voice was soft, but Reed had followed Everett long enough to recognize the danger beneath that calm. A 6-year-old disappears and no one goes looking? Reed said nothing. He didn't need to. The answer was already clear. No one searched because no one wanted to. This child hadn't been lost. He'd been thrown away. Late at night, Obsidian had been closed for a long time. The last guests had gone home. The staff had finished cleaning and drifted away. Only Everett remained, alone in the office on the highest floor, where he could see all of Chicago stretching out beyond the glass wall. He poured a glass of whiskey, amber catching the lamplight, but he didn't drink. He only held the glass and watched the city lights blinking outside like a million stars that had fallen to the ground. Tonight, his mind wouldn't settle. Everett set the glass down, pulled open the hidden drawer beneath his desk, the one no one knew existed except him. Inside there was only one thing, an old photograph, the border yellowed, the colors fading with time. He lifted it, his fingers brushing lightly over the smooth surface. Jamie, his son, 5 years old in this picture. A radiant smile filled his round face, gray eyes identical to Everett's shining with joy, his arms wrapped around a new soccer ball, standing in the backyard of the house they used to live in, 18 years ago. It felt like a lifetime, and yet it also felt like yesterday. Jamie had been born with a weak heart, a congenital defect the doctors discovered in those very first days. They said surgery was possible, that there was hope, that they only had to wait until the boy was big enough, strong enough. And Everett waited. He hoped. He did everything he could, found the best doctors, the best hospital. Money was never the issue, but the night before the operation, when everything was ready, when hope was closest, that small heart stopped, without warning, without time for goodbyes. Jamie died in Everett's arms, in the quiet middle of the night, while the boy slept, and Everett kept watch beside the bed. 5 years old, not old enough to grow up, not old enough to start school, not old enough to learn how wide the world could be. His wife couldn't bear it. She blamed Everett, said he was married to his work, said he wasn't there enough, said if he'd been home more, then maybe he would have noticed the signs sooner. Maybe she was right. Maybe she wasn't. Everett never knew. She left, taking her grief and her bitterness with her. And Everett didn't stop her. He didn't have the strength to stop her. He didn't have the reason. After that, the Black King shut his heart. 18 years. He didn't love anyone. He didn't let anyone close. He built an empire, expanded his power, became a name that made all of Chicago afraid. But inside, where no one could see, there was an emptiness shaped like a 5-year-old boy, with a radiant smile and gray eyes identical to his. Everett set the photograph down and turned to the security camera monitor on his desk. The small room appeared on the screen, washed in the soft gold of the nightlight. Noah was asleep, still curled in the corner the way he had been the night before, still holding Buddy as if he feared someone might snatch him away. The boy was close to the age Jamie had been when Jamie died, the same small frame, the same fragility. But Jamie had gone because of a weak heart, and Noah was living with a heart shattered by other people. Everett stared at the screen, at the boy inside it, and he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Noah wasn't Jamie. No one could replace Jamie. He wasn't looking for a replacement. He didn't need anyone to fill that hollow. But he could save this child. He could protect him in the way he hadn't been able to protect his own son. He could give the boy a chance Jamie never got to have. Everett folded Jamie's photograph carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, right over his heart, where it had always been, where it would always remain. Outside the glass, Chicago stayed awake. The lights kept blinking. Life kept moving forward. But in this silent office, a decision had been made. No words needed, no witnesses required. The Black King had decided. A week passed, and Noah began to grow used to the rhythm of life at Obsidian. He still slept in the corner of the room instead of the bed, still ate in tiny bites as if afraid the food would be snatched away, still walked on tiptoe and tried to make himself as invisible as possible. But he didn't fold in on himself anymore every time someone entered the room. He didn't tremble anymore at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. It was progress, even if it was small. One afternoon, when slanting sunlight came through the window and laid bands of gold across the floor, Joey appeared in the doorway of Noah's room. The Italian chef stood there in a white apron still dusted with flour, a radiant smile on his round face, kind brown eyes like a grandfather from a fairy tale. "Hey there, little man," Joey said, his Italian accent making every word sound as if it were being sung. "Do you want to see the kitchen?" Noah sat on the floor with Buddy in his lap and looked up at him. The kitchen. The word made the boy go rigid for a moment. Kitchens had knives, fire, boiling water, things that could hurt people. And a kitchen was where he'd once been punished for breaking a plate. He still remembered the sound of shattering porcelain, the shouting, and then the pain that came afterward. But Joey's smile was too warm. His eyes were too gentle. There was nothing in that look that resembled Warren's. No anger waiting to pounce, no hand ready to rise. Noah hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded very slightly. He stood, still gripping Buddy, and followed Joey down the stairs. Obsidian's kitchen opened up in front of him like another world, shining steel everywhere, pots and pans hanging in neat rows on the walls, the rich smell of herbs and spices, the hiss from hot pans, the quick click of knives against cutting boards. The other cooks looked at Noah with curiosity, but no one said anything, only nodded in greeting and went back to work. Joey led Noah to a quieter corner, to his own workstation. He pulled over a tall stool, helped Noah up, lifting him until he stood level with the countertop. "Today, I'm going to teach you how to make pancakes," Joey announced, setting a large bowl in front of Noah. "My Benedetti family's secret recipe, passed down from my grandmother." He guided him through each step, slow and patient. Pour the flour into the bowl. Add eggs. Add milk. Stir until smooth. Noah tried with fierce concentration. Brown eyes narrowed, brows drawn tight as if he were solving a difficult equation. He wanted to do it right. He needed to do it right. Because doing it wrong meant punishment. He'd learned that a long time ago. But his little hands were still too clumsy, the wooden spoon too big, the bowl too heavy. When Noah tried to stir harder, the bowl tilted, and half the batter spilled across the counter, ran down the apron, splattered onto the floor. Noah froze. The spoon fell from his hand. His eyes went wide, his face went white, his whole body locked up. He knew what would come next. The yelling, the slap, maybe worse. He shut his eyes, hunched his shoulders, and waited. But it didn't come. Instead, laughter rang out. Big laughter, from the belly, warm and delighted. Noah opened his eyes, bewildered, and looked at Joey. The chef was laughing, truly laughing, with not a trace of anger in his eyes. "Perfetto," Joey cried, clapping his hands. "Perfect. Spilling batter is the first step to becoming a great chef. I spilled batter for 10 years before I learned how not to spill." Noah didn't understand. This grown man wasn't angry. He wasn't going to punish him. He'd spilled the batter, made a mess of the kitchen. He should have been hit. That was the rule. That was what he'd been taught. Joey dipped a finger into the batter on the counter, then gently dabbed it on Noah's nose, leaving a white dot. "See?" He winked. "Now you look like a real chef." And then a strange sound rose in the kitchen. Small, shy, like it had forgotten how to come out. Laughter. Noah was laughing. Not a polite smile, not a frightened smile meant to please an adult, but real laughter, breaking loose from somewhere deep in his chest, a place the boy had thought had died a long time ago. Joey turned toward the kitchen doorway and stopped. Everett stood there, his back against the frame, arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on Noah. The chef stepped closer, voice a whisper, eyes shining with tears. "The boy laughed, boss," for the first time. Maggie Cole kept her distance from Noah in those first days. She watched him from afar, watched the way he tiptoed down the hallway, the way he sat as still as a statue in the corner of a room, the way he held the old teddy bear like the last treasure left on earth. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't close either. She'd lived long enough, seen enough, endured enough, not to soften easily for anyone. 43 years had taught Maggie that kindness wasn't always repaid, that people could betray you at any moment, that keeping your distance was the best way to protect yourself. So she watched. She waited. She assessed, the way she did with everyone. One afternoon, as the restaurant prepared for the evening service, Maggie moved from table to table, her sharp eyes sweeping over every detail. The tablecloths had to lie flat without a single wrinkle. The cutlery had to be placed in the correct position, spaced the correct distance apart. The wine glasses had to be spotless without a single smudge. The candles had to be set exactly in the center. That was Obsidian's standard. That was Maggie Cole's standard. She was adjusting the position of a vase when she noticed Noah standing a few steps away, staring at a table near the window. He stood motionless like a carved figure, his head slightly tilted, brown eyes fixed on a single point. Maggie frowned. "What are you looking at?" Her voice wasn't harsh, but it wasn't soft either. Noah startled, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. He took a step back, dropped his gaze, his shoulders drawing in with the familiar reflex. The napkin," he whispered, so quiet it was barely there. It isn't even." Maggie turned to look at that table. The white napkin was folded into a lotus shape, set neatly on the plate. At first glance, it was perfect. But when she stepped closer and looked again, she saw it. The right corner was off by a few millimeters. A mistake so small even she had almost missed it. But this 6-year-old had seen it. Maggie turned back to Noah, assessing him with new eyes. Eyes so sharp it was startling. An attention to detail that some of her staff didn't have even after a year here. "You're right," she said, her voice still even, but no longer distant. "Do you want to learn how to fold napkins the right way?" Noah looked up, brown eyes wide with surprise, as if he didn't believe he'd heard her, as if he were waiting for her to say it was a joke, or worse, waiting to be scolded for daring to point out someone else's mistake. But none of that happened. Maggie only stood there and waited. The boy nodded very slightly. Maggie pulled out a chair, and Noah climbed up, setting Buddy on the table beside him so his hands were free. She took a fresh napkin, smoothed it flat in front of him, and began to teach, one step at a time. Fold in half. Fold again. Turn the corner. Roll it gently. Shape the petals. Noah learned so fast it surprised Maggie. His small hands were clumsy at first, but after only a few tries, he folded a napkin that was nearly perfect. He set it down, looked up at Maggie, his brown eyes tight with worry. "Is it okay? Did I do it right? I can do it again if..." His voice trembled, as if bracing for criticism, bracing for disappointment, bracing for the words that he was useless and couldn't do anything right. And in that moment, Maggie understood. This boy was used to having to be perfect. Not because he wanted to be, because he had to be. Because imperfect meant punishment. Because he had to be useful to be kept. Because he'd been taught that his worth was measured by what he could do for other people, not by who he was. Maggie's heart, a heart hardened by so many years, suddenly ached. Her voice softened, for the first time truly gentle since the boy had walked into Obsidian. "It's perfect, Noah. You did very well." That night, after the restaurant closed, Maggie carried a glass of warm milk and a plate of cookies up to Noah's room with her own hands. The boy was sitting in his usual corner, Buddy in his lap, looking up at her with startled eyes. Maggie set the tray on the small table, then looked at him. "You can call me Aunt Maggie," she said, her voice still firm, but her eyes different now. "If you want." Noah watched her for a long time, as if weighing it, judging it, trying to understand whether it was a trap. Then he nodded, so slightly it was almost invisible. But Maggie saw it, and in her chest, another wall began to fall. 3 weeks passed, and Noah changed day by day like a flower slowly opening after a long winter. His cheeks were less hollow now, the sharp angles softening into a little fullness from Uncle Joey's steady meals. His brown eyes were less wild, less like the gaze of a small animal trapped in a corner, replaced instead by the shy curiosity of a child learning how to trust the world. He dared to meet other people's eyes when he spoke, even if only for a few seconds before dropping his gaze out of habit. He dared to sit in a chair instead of curling up on the floor, even though he still chose the seat closest to the wall. He began to talk more. No longer only nods and shakes of his head, but short, small sentences. Sometimes only a few words, yet it was a beginning. "Doctor." Rachel came for a regular checkup at the end of the 3rd week, and this time her face didn't go pale the way it had the first time. She checked his weight, his height, the injuries that were healing, then spoke gently with Noah about Buddy, about the pancakes he'd learned to make with Uncle Joey, about the napkin folding he'd learned from Aunt Maggie. Noah answered, his voice still soft but no longer trembling, and Rachel smiled with quiet satisfaction. After the exam, she pulled Everett out into the hallway as she always did, but this time, her expression was different. "He's recovering better than I expected," Rachel said, closing her notebook. "His physical health is improving clearly. Psychologically, it will take longer, but there's significant progress." She paused and looked at Everett. "And there's something you should know." Everett waited. "He's chosen you as his safe person," Rachel said. "Wherever you are, he feels protected. That's a very good sign. It means he's learning to trust again. But it also means you have to be very careful. If you disappear, if you break that trust, the consequences could be very serious." Everett nodded, said nothing, but he stored every word, and when he went back into the room and saw Noah sitting there, scribbling on a sheet of paper, he realized Rachel was right. Noah's brown eyes lifted immediately the moment Everett stepped in, as if he'd been waiting, as if he'd been watching the door every second. And Everett realized it had been happening for a long time without him noticing. Noah's eyes were always searching for him in a room. No matter what he was doing, no matter where he was, the boy always knew exactly where Everett was. If Everett left, Noah would silently watch him go until he came back. No crying, no calling out, only watching and waiting. One evening, after the restaurant closed, Everett sat in the VIP lounge, reading financial reports beneath the desk lamp. Noah sat on the nearby sofa, legs drawn up, Buddy beside him, a colored pencil in his hand as he scribbled on the paper Joey had given him. The room was quiet, only the soft rustle of paper and the faint scratch of pencil on the page. A peaceful silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words, the kind that belonged to people who were comfortable simply being near one another. Then, suddenly, Everett felt a tiny hand touch his hand. He looked down. Noah had moved without him noticing, and was sitting right beside him on the sofa now. The boy didn't say anything, didn't look at him, only laid his small hand on the back of Everett's hand, then kept drawing with his other hand, as if he needed to be sure Everett was still there, still real, still not gone. Everett went rigid. That little hand was warm, weightless, the small fingers resting lightly on his skin. Yet it was heavier than anything he'd ever held, heavier than multi-million-dollar contracts. Heavier than the power to rule half of Chicago. Heavier than the years he'd spent building this empire. A 6-year-old boy's hand, placed on his in silence, like a wordless plea. Noah looked up, brown eyes meeting Everett's eyes, clear and deep. "You won't disappear, will you?" The boy's voice was small, but Everett heard every word. He heard the fear beneath it, too. The fear of a child who had lost too much, been abandoned too many times, learned that adults could vanish at any moment. Everett set the reports aside, turned toward him, and closed his hand around the small one. "I'll be here, Noah," he said, his voice low and certain. "I promise." One morning, Joey appeared in Noah's doorway with a large paper bag in his hand, a smile as bright as sunshine on his round face. He walked in, set the bag down in front of the boy who was sitting on the floor with Buddy in his arms, then pulled things out one by one like he was performing a magic trick. A big box of crayons with 24 vivid colors, a thick pad of pristine white drawing paper, a set of colored pencils, and a small watercolor kit with soft brushes. "Every artist needs tools," Joey said, ruffling Noah's hair. "And I've got a feeling you're going to be a wonderful artist." Noah stared at the things in front of him, brown eyes wide as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He looked at the crayon box, at the colors shining behind the clear plastic, as if he were looking at the greatest treasure in the world. Never in the short 6 years of his life had he been allowed to own anything new. Never had there been something that belonged only to him, except Buddy and painful memories. The clothes he wore at Aunt Brenda's house were old, leftovers. There were no toys, no books, either. He was only an extra child, a child who didn't deserve to have anything. It's mine?" Noah asked, his voice tiny, as if speaking too loudly would break the dream. Joey nodded, his eyes shining. "It's yours. Only yours." After Joey left, Noah sat for a long time in front of the blank sheet of paper spread out on the floor. He held the crayon box, opened it, looked at the crayons lined up neatly in a rainbow row, then closed it again. then opened it again, like he didn't know what to do with them. He looked at the white page, his mind empty. What should he draw? He'd never been allowed to draw freely, never been asked what he wanted, never been allowed to have an opinion of his own. At Aunt Brenda's, he only had to be silent, invisible, and obey orders. Wanting or not wanting didn't matter. He didn't matter. But now, with a blank page and 24 colors waiting, the boy had to decide for himself. He had to ask himself what he wanted, and that question was harder than anything he'd ever faced. Time passed. 1 hour, 2 hours. Noah still sat there, thinking, hesitating. Then, at last, he picked up a blue crayon and began to draw. The first scribbles, clumsy and uneven, then more color, more shapes, colors layered over one another, sometimes smudged, sometimes spilling outside the lines. But he kept drawing, sinking into his own world, forgetting time. That evening, while Everett sat in his office reviewing a few contracts, there was a soft knock at the door. The door opened a crack, and Noah appeared, stepping in with his familiar hesitant steps, both hands hidden behind his back. "I made something," he said, his voice small. "For you." Noah held out a piece of paper, offering it toward Everett with hands that trembled slightly. Everett took it and looked down. A small house with yellow windows, smoke rising from the chimney. Beside the house were 2 figures, a tall person dressed in black, and next to him a tiny boy with a teddy bear in his hand. Above them, carefully written in red crayon, was a single word: home. Noah looked down, worry spilling out of him. "It's ugly, isn't it? I can draw it again. I'll do better." Everett didn't hear the rest. He only looked at the picture, at the little house, at the 2 figures standing together, at the word home scrawled in the hand of a 6-year-old. His throat tightened, his eyes stung. The word home danced in front of him, blurring and sharpening again. "This," Everett said, his voice rough, "is the most beautiful picture I've ever seen." Noah looked up, brown eyes bright, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. The next day, the drawing was carefully framed and hung neatly in Everett's office, in the first place he would see whenever he sat down at his desk, where he could look at it every day, see the small house, see the 2 figures, see the word home. A month passed, and life at Obsidian had become a new normal for Noah. The boy had his own schedule now, a luxury he'd never had before. In the morning, a tutor came to teach him reading, writing, and math, making up for the 2 years he hadn't been allowed to go to school. In the afternoon, he helped Joey in the kitchen, learning how to knead dough, decorate pastries, and taste new dishes. In the evening, he sat and drew or read picture books Joey had bought, Buddy always beside him. He still slept in the corner of the room instead of the bed, but now he'd accepted lying on the soft mattress Maggie had placed on the floor for him. He still ate in small bites, but he didn't apologize anymore when he finished his portion. He still moved quietly, but he no longer tiptoed as if trying to disappear. Progress, little by little, like a young tree slowly rising after a storm. That Saturday night, Obsidian was crowded as usual, soft jazz, candlelight shimmering, the scent of exquisite food drifting through the air. Noah was in the kitchen with Joey, standing on his familiar stool, learning how to dust powdered sugar over a cake. He was intensely focused, his tongue sticking out just a little as he tried to sprinkle it evenly, and Joey stood beside him, guiding him with endless patience. "Very good, Piccolo," Joey praised. "You have steadier hands than many head chefs I've known." Noah smiled, a small smile, but no longer as rare as before. Then the noise from the front of the restaurant carried back, shouting, tables scraping and falling. Panicked screams. Joey stopped, frowning. The other cooks looked up, exchanging worried glances. The sounds grew louder, closer, and then a voice boomed. A man's voice rasped raw with alcohol, roaring like an animal. "Where's the kid? Where's that kid of mine?" Noah went rigid. The spoon slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, but he didn't hear it. He didn't hear anything anymore except that voice. The voice from his nightmares. The voice that had roared before every blow. The voice that had screamed in his face that he was useless, that he was a burden, that he deserved to be hit. Warren Holt. "No," Noah whispered, his voice shaking. "No, no, no, no." His face turned paper white, his whole body trembling uncontrollably. He backed away, and kept backing away until his back hit the corner of the kitchen. Then he folded down, arms over his head, curled into a small ball, the way he'd done hundreds of times to protect himself from punches. Joey moved instantly. He stepped in front of Noah, shielding the boy from anyone's view. "Behind me, Piccolo." His voice was low and firm. "I won't let anyone touch you." Out in the dining room, chaos was unfolding. Warren Holt burst through the front doors, tall and thin, his face flushed red with drink, his eyes cloudy and crazed. He shoved down a waiter who tried to block him, knocked over a table, wine glasses shattering across the floor. "That kid belongs with me," he roared, spit flying. "You have no right to keep him." Customers panicked, some standing up to run, some clutching their phones to call the police. A perfect Saturday night turned into a nightmare in seconds. Maggie Cole stepped forward to block Warren, her face ice cold, sharp eyes locked on the drunken man in front of her. "You need to leave. Immediately." Her voice didn't shake. Warren looked at her, sneered, then threw up a hand and shoved her aside with a hard push. "Get out of my way." Maggie stumbled but didn't fall, catching herself on the back of a chair to keep her balance. Warren pushed deeper into the restaurant, his crazed eyes sweeping every corner, searching. "No, I know you're here. Get out here now." And then, silence. Warren was advancing when he stopped in mid-step. He didn't understand why he'd stopped until he realized the entire restaurant had frozen. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Every pair of eyes was fixed on something behind him. Warren turned. Everett Ashford stepped out from the back hallway, slow, each step steady, unhurried. No shouting, no running, only walking, like a predator moving toward its prey. The warm gold light fell across his face, carving sharp shadows along his cheekbones, throwing his eyes into relief. Eyes cold as ice, cold as death waiting. The whole restaurant seemed to stop breathing. Everett halted a few steps from Warren and looked him up and down with the gaze of someone assessing an insect. Then he spoke, his voice as light as winter wind, yet sharper than any roar. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Everett stood facing Warren, only a few steps away, no more. He didn't shout. He didn't make loud threats. He didn't raise a fist or pull a weapon. He only stood there and looked at him, but that look was more frightening than any threat. Gray eyes cold as steel, as ice, as death waiting. There was no burning rage in them, only the predator's calm calculation, measuring its prey. Warren Holt was used to bullying, used to beating children who couldn't fight back, used to screaming at women who didn't dare argue, used to using his fists and his roar to control people weaker than him. But he wasn't stupid. A coward's survival instinct is sharp. And right now that instinct was screaming in his head that the man in front of him was dangerous. Dangerous in a completely different way. Dangerous in a way Warren's fists and shouting couldn't reach. I have a right," Warren bellowed, but his voice was shaking now, the drunkenness thinning as fear seeped in. "He's my wife's nephew. I'm his legal guardian." Everett stepped forward. One step. Slow. Even. Like a beast hunting, unhurried because it knows the prey can't escape. "You failed him in every way." Everett's voice was light, almost a whisper, but each word fell like a hammer on Warren's skull. "Another step. You took away his light. Another step. You made him believe he didn't deserve to exist." Warren backed up a step, then another, but his back hit something hard. He turned and froze. Reed stood there, expressionless, eyes cold as stone. And not only Reed. 4 other men had appeared from the corners of the restaurant, surrounding Warren like wolves closing in on prey. No one said a word. No one needed a signal. They knew what to do. They always knew. Everett kept walking, now only an arm's length away. "You made him afraid to cry." His voice stayed quiet, stayed calm, but that calm was more terrifying than any fury. Afraid to eat. Afraid to breathe too loudly. Afraid to exist. Warren realized where he was. He looked around and saw the hard faces of the men closing him in. He looked at Everett Ashford standing in front of him. And finally, his alcohol-soaked mind put the pieces together. Obsidian. Everett Ashford's restaurant. Everett Ashford. The name all of Chicago whispered with fear. The Black King. The man who ruled half the city's underworld. The man whose single nod could make someone disappear without a trace. "Do you know who I am?" Everett asked, his voice still a whisper, tilting his head as he looked at Warren the way you'd look at an insect. Warren knew. All of Chicago knew, and now he understood why his instinct had been screaming alarms from the very first second. His face drained of color, the drunkenness vanishing completely, replaced by pure fear. His legs shook, nearly buckling. I didn't mean to," he stammered, his voice stripped of any brutality, leaving only the pathetic pleading of a coward facing someone stronger. I'll go right now. Please, sir." Everett didn't answer. He only looked at Warren for a few more seconds, those eyes holding not a drop of mercy, then turned to Reed. "Take him out back. I'll deal with him later." Reed nodded. 2 men stepped in, each grabbing one of Warren's arms, hauling him away. Warren started screaming, begging, his feet trying to dig into the floor, but it was useless. "Please, I won't come back, I swear. Please, have mercy." His cries faded, then vanished when the back door shut. The restaurant remained silent as a sheet of paper. No one dared move. No one dared breathe too loudly. Everett didn't linger to reassure customers or explain anything at all. He turned and moved quickly toward the kitchen, his heart pounding for a reason entirely different from the anger just moments ago. Noah. He pushed the kitchen door open and saw the boy. Noah was still in the corner, folded into a small ball, both hands clamped over his head, his whole body shaking. Joey was kneeling beside him, trying to say something soothing, but the boy seemed not to hear. Everett stepped closer, and his footsteps sounded in the quiet kitchen. Familiar footsteps. A familiar rhythm. Noah opened his eyes, brown eyes wet with tears, panicked, looked up and saw Everett standing there. And the boy lunged, without a word, without waiting a second. Noah ran straight to Everett and wrapped both small arms around his leg, pressing his face into the fabric of his trousers, as if letting go would mean losing everything. Everett bent down, slid his arms beneath Noah, and lifted the boy up. Noah was so light, Everett almost staggered, not because of the weight, but because of the absence of it. This 6-year-old was light as a feather, like something the wind could carry away at any moment. Noah clung to Everett's neck, both small arms wrapped around him as if letting go would send him falling into a deep abyss, his face pressed into Everett's shoulder, his whole body still trembling uncontrollably. Everett moved quickly down the hallway, up the stairs, carrying the boy into his private room, far from the chaos below, far from curious eyes, far from anything that could frighten him even more. He closed the door, and in the quiet of the room, he heard it, crying. Not the silent, choked crying of nightmares, not the restrained sobbing held back for fear of bothering anyone, but real crying, loud, breaking open, like a dam that had held too long finally bursting, like 2 years of tears forced down, swallowed back, finally being allowed to pour out. Noah cried like he'd never been allowed to cry, the crying of a child who had forgotten how to cry, now remembering and unable to stop. His shoulders shook in waves, tears soaked Everett's shirt, and ragged sobs tore through the still room. "Please don't send me back," Noah sobbed, his voice thick with desperation. "Please, I'll be good, I'll be better, I'll do anything. Please don't send me back to him. Please, please." Every word cut Everett's heart like a knife. He held the boy tighter, one arm supporting Noah's back, the other shielding his head, as if he could use his own body as a barrier between this child and everything evil in the world. "Noah," he said, his voice low but certain, "listen to me." He lowered Noah gently until the boy stood in front of him, his hands on Noah's shoulders. Then Everett sank down, one knee to the floor, until his eyes were level with Noah's tear-flooded brown eyes, the way it had been the first night they met in the sleet. The way he always did when he wanted Noah to know they were equal, that he was listening, that the boy mattered. "You will never go back there," Everett said, each word clear, solid, without a flicker of doubt. "Never, I promise you." Noah stared at him, tears still streaming down his cheeks, his lips trembling. But he said I belong to him." "You don't belong to anyone, Noah," Everett said, his hands tightening gently on the boy's shoulders. "You aren't property. You aren't an object. You're a person. A brave, strong, wonderful person." Noah blinked, as if he didn't understand what he'd just heard, as if it were a strange language he'd never been taught. But why?" he asked, his voice tiny, full of confusion. "Why are you good to me?" Everett was silent. That question was simple, in the cruelest way. A 6-year-old had to ask why someone was being kind to him, because he was so used to being treated badly that kindness had become something he couldn't understand. Everett looked into those brown eyes that had seen far too much suffering for a child, and he answered, his voice rough with the emotion rising in him. "Because you deserve to be loved, Noah. You always have. You always will." Noah kept looking at him, as if trying to make sure what Everett was saying was real. That this wasn't a dream. That there wouldn't be a sudden turn that made everything collapse. Then the boy threw himself into Everett's arms, clung to him, and cried again. He cried until there were no tears left. He cried until his small body gave out. He cried until he fell asleep in the arms of the man all of Chicago feared. That night, the Black King didn't leave the room. He sat there with his back against the headboard. Noah curled against him. Buddy clutched tight in the boy's arms, sitting watch over the sleep of a 6-year-old child. And in the dark of that room, the Black King made a silent vow. No one would ever be able to touch this boy again. No one. Never. The basement of a building on the south side, where streetlights never reached, where the noise of Chicago couldn't travel down, where whatever happened would never be known by anyone. Warren Holt sat on a wooden chair in the middle of an empty room, his hands bound behind his back with plastic ties, his face the pale green of a corpse. He hadn't been beaten, not a bruise, not a drop of blood. Everett Ashford didn't need violence for a man like Warren. Everett's presence alone, those eyes fixed on him, was enough to make Warren nearly lose control of his bladder. He was trembling, not from cold, but from fear. Everett sat opposite him, one leg crossed over the other, relaxed as if he were in his own living room. In one hand he held a glass of whiskey, turning it slightly as the light caught the amber in the liquor. He looked at Warren the way you'd look at an insect, not with disgust, not with anger, only the cool indifference of someone deciding another man's fate. "I'll give you 2 choices, Mr. Holt," Everett said, his tone as calm as if he were talking about the weather, as if he were discussing a dinner menu. Warren swallowed, his throat bone dry. That calm was more frightening than any snarl. "Choice 1, Everett went on, nodding toward Reed. Reed stepped forward and set a thin stack of papers on a small table in front of Warren. "You sign this document. You relinquish every right and every claim to Noah Carter. You leave Chicago tonight. You never come back. You never contact anyone here again. You disappear." Everett took a sip of whiskey and watched Warren over the rim of the glass. Warren wet his cracked lips, his eyes darting back and forth between the papers and Everett. He wanted to ask what would happen if he refused. He wanted to ask whether he had any rights. He wanted to say this was kidnapping, unlawful detention, a violation of the law. But he couldn't make the words come out, because he knew that here, in this basement, in front of this man, the law meant nothing at all. "And what about choice 2? Warren asked, his voice rasping, almost soundless. Everett tilted his head, his mouth curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of a predator playing with its prey. "You don't want to know choice 2. Silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Warren stared into Everett's eyes, searching for any sign of mercy, any flicker of hesitation, any gap he might slip through. He found nothing, only death looking back at him, cold, patient, certain. His hands shook so badly Reed had to cut the ties so he could hold a pen. Warren took it, the tip trembling over the page, and then he signed. Signed each sheet, signed each place, Reed pointed out. Signed as if he were signing his own reprieve. "Good choice." Everett stood, set the whiskey glass down on the table, and walked toward the door, Reed following with the signed papers. At the threshold, Everett didn't turn back. He only spoke over his shoulder, his voice light as a passing breeze. "If I see your face within 500 miles of this city again, you will wish you hadn't." Warren didn't answer. He couldn't. He only sat there shaking, watching the door close, and realized he'd escaped death by the narrowest margin. 1 hour later, in Everett's office at Obsidian, Everett held the old guardianship document Warren had signed when Noah was placed with the Holts 2 years earlier. He looked at it for a moment, then set it in an ashtray and struck a match. Flame leapt up, licked along the paper's edge, spread, devouring every word. Everett watched it burn, watched Noah's past become ash. Reed stood beside him in silence, then asked, "What about the aunt?" Everett didn't take his eyes off the dying fire. "She'll sign too. She's too afraid to do otherwise." The paper burned down to nothing, leaving only a pinch of gray ash in the ashtray. The past turned to ash, and Noah would never have to be afraid again. 2 weeks after the Warren incident, things slowly settled again. Warren Holt vanished from Chicago as promised, boarded a night bus headed west, and no one heard a word about him after that. Brenda Holt, Noah's aunt, signed the papers relinquishing guardianship only a few days later, without a single protest, without a single question about her nephew. She was too afraid of the name Everett Ashford to do anything except comply. Noah clung to Everett more tightly in the first days after it happened, like a small shadow that wouldn't leave his side for even half a step. He slept in Everett's room instead of his own, curled on the mattress on the floor right beside Everett's bed. Buddy held tight the way it always was. But gradually, day by day, the fear eased. The boy began to sleep through the night without nightmares, began to laugh more with Joey in the kitchen, began to speak to Maggie without dropping his head to stare at the floor. One Sunday afternoon, when spring sunlight poured through Obsidian's windows, Everett walked into Noah's room and made an offer. "Do you want to go out today?" Noah looked up from the picture book he was reading, brown eyes wide. Go out. Outside Obsidian. Outside the safe walls he'd grown used to over the last nearly 2 months. The world outside was vast, unfamiliar, frightening. He hesitated, looked down at Buddy in his lap, then looked at Everett, then looked toward the window where sunlight was calling. Then he nodded, very slight but clear. Lincoln Park on a Sunday afternoon was full of life. Golden sunlight filtered through green leaves, scattering bright flecks that danced on the ground. Children's laughter rang everywhere, birdsong, the soft hiss of wind moving through branches. The lake gleamed like a mirror, reflecting the blue sky, ducks gliding lazily over the calm surface. Noah walked beside Everett, one hand gripping Everett's hand, the other holding Buddy against his chest. His brown eyes kept scanning everything, alert to every sound, every movement, like a small animal exploring new territory. It was the first time he'd been outside since that sleety night, the night he'd stood in front of Obsidian and asked if anyone wanted to take in a boy. They followed the path along the lake, Everett slowing his stride to match Noah's small steps. People passing by looked at them with curiosity, the tall man in a black coat and the tiny boy holding a teddy bear, but no one looked for long once they met Everett's eyes. Cheerful music drifted from ahead. An ice cream truck painted in bright colors was parked by the path. Children lined up in front of it, chatter and laughter in the air. Noah stopped, eyes fixed on the truck, watching other children holding ice cream, licking happily. Everett recognized that look. "Do you want ice cream?" Noah looked at the truck, then at Everett, then back at the truck. He swallowed. Then he asked, in that tiny voice, so familiar it hurt, Am I allowed?" Everett didn't answer with words. He simply led Noah to the truck and bought him a chocolate ice cream bar, the kind with a thick coating of chocolate on the outside that every child loves. He placed it in Noah's hand and watched the boy hold it like treasure. Noah took a careful lick. His brown eyes lit up like stars, sweetness melting on his tongue, deep chocolate, the cool bite of ice cream on a warm afternoon. For the first time in 2 years, he got to eat ice cream. They found a stone bench near the lake and sat down. Everett watched Noah eat, one bite at a time, slow, savoring it, chocolate smearing around his mouth, and the boy not caring. His legs swung gently, not reaching the ground, and for the first time, Noah looked like an ordinary child. Not an abused child, not an abandoned child, just a 6-year-old boy eating ice cream in a park on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. "Everett?" Noah said, voice small. Everett turned, and his heart gave a small jolt. It was the first time the boy had said his name. Not sir or uncle, the way he usually did, but his name, his real name. Noah smiled, chocolate at the corner of his mouth, brown eyes shining in the sunlight. "This is really nice." Everett looked at the boy, at that small smile, at that bright gaze, and felt his heart warm in a way he'd forgotten existed. "Yeah," he nodded, voice quiet. "It is 3 months since that first night of sleet, the night a barefoot boy stood in front of Obsidian and asked if anyone wanted to take in a child. 3 months had changed everything. Everett's attorney finished every legal procedure in the final week. Brenda Holt, Noah's biological aunt, signed the papers relinquishing guardianship without a single objection. Not one question about her nephew. Not one tear. Not one apology. Only a careless scrawl on the page, and the silence of someone who wanted to forget it all. She was too afraid of the name Everett Ashford to do anything other than comply. Too afraid even to ask what had happened to her husband. Too afraid to realize she'd lost her chance at redemption forever. Noah officially became a ward of the state, an orphan with no legal guardian in the eyes of the law. On paper, the boy belonged to no one now. But in reality, he had a family. He had Uncle Joey, teaching him to bake every afternoon. He had Aunt Maggie, teaching him napkin folding and reading. He had Reed, always standing guard outside the door like a silent protector. And he had Everett, the man all of Chicago called the Black King, the man who sat beside him each night until he fell asleep, the man who promised he would never have to be afraid again. Everett filed to adopt Noah as soon as he could. The process wasn't easy. He was a single man, with no experience raising a child, and he had a complicated reputation that made social workers frown when they looked at his file. On paper, he was a restaurant owner and a businessman, but everyone knew there was more than that, even if no one dared say it out loud. Still, his file held other things, too. A 12-page report from Dr. Rachel Winters, documenting Noah's remarkable recovery in detail, from a malnourished child terrified to eat to a boy who could laugh, who could play, who could trust. Maggie Cole's testimony about a stable, safe home environment. Giuseppe Benedetti's testimony about the bond between Everett and Noah. And a dozen other staff members ready to go to court if needed. And there were arrangements no one asked about. Phone calls made at the right time, generous contributions to the Child Welfare Fund, doors that suddenly opened where they had been firmly shut before. Everett Ashford didn't let anything stand in his way once he'd decided. The court date was set for the following week. The night before the momentous day, Everett sat beside Noah's bed in the small room that had become the boy's home. Noah had agreed to sleep on the bed a few weeks earlier, a major step everyone celebrated in quiet. Buddy lay on the pillow beside him, tied with a small bow Joey had given him. "Tomorrow is an important day," Everett said gently in the darkness. "Do you know what might happen?" Noah lay still, brown eyes wide as he watched Everett in the soft gold of the nightlight. He'd heard Aunt Maggie and Uncle Joey whisper about tomorrow. He'd seen everyone preparing new clothes for him. He'd felt the air itself filled with anticipation and nervous hope. Can I get a forever?" Noah asked, his voice small, as if speaking too loudly would break the dream. Everett nodded, his chest tightening at the fragility in that question. A child who didn't dare dream of forever because he was used to being left behind. "Do you want that? With me?" Noah didn't answer with words. He sat up, wrapped his small arms around Everett's neck, and held on tight. Held on with all the strength in his small body. Held on as if letting go would mean losing everything. And that was all the answer Everett needed. That morning, the Chicago sun poured brightly through Obsidian's windows like a good omen. Noah stood in front of the mirror in his room, wearing a brand new white shirt and navy dress pants, the first outfit in his life bought just for him, chosen just for him, belonging only to him. Maggie had been up since 5 o'clock to get everything ready, and now she stood behind him, a comb smoothing every stubborn strand of brown hair into place. "Hold still," she said, her voice firm but her eyes gentle. "Today you have to look your very best." Noah stood as still as a statue, letting Aunt Maggie adjust every smallest detail. He didn't fully understand everything that would happen today, but he knew it mattered, more than anything that had ever happened in his life. Joey appeared in the doorway, holding something small and red. "Come here, Piccolo," he beckoned Noah over, then knelt in front of him and tied a small red bow around Buddy's neck. "For luck," he winked, his voice trembling a little. "Buddy has to look handsome for the big day, too." The Chicago family court sat in an old building downtown, historic architecture with tall stone columns and arched windows. When the black car stopped at the entrance, Noah looked out with tense brown eyes. He gripped Everett's hand as he stepped out. Buddy held tight in his other arm. The entire Obsidian family was there, Maggie in a proper black suit, Joey in a rare white shirt instead of his usual apron, Reed standing behind them, his face still unreadable, but present, because this mattered. Dr. Rachel came as well, carrying a thick file on Noah's recovery. They weren't related by blood, but they were family. The courtroom wasn't large, but it was solemn, with rows of oak benches and the flag hanging behind the judge's seat. Light from tall windows fell in long bands across the polished wooden floor. The judge was a silver-haired woman, probably in her 60s, with eyes that were sharp but not unkind. She had sat in this chair for decades, had witnessed thousands of family cases, had seen both happy endings and tragedies beyond words. She studied the file on her desk, turning each page with the careful attention of someone who didn't want to miss a single detail. Then she began to ask questions. Everett's lawyer presented the case. Rachel was called to testify, speaking about Noah's condition when she first met him, and the remarkable transformation over the past 3 months. Maggie was asked about the boy's daily home environment, questions about financial ability, about education plans, about raising a child with psychological trauma. Everett answered each one, calm, clear, unshaken, even though this was the first time in his life he'd sat in court as the one asking rather than the one being asked. Noah sat beside Everett, feet not reaching the floor, Buddy with the red bow in his arms, brown eyes tracking everything with a strain no 6-year-old should have to carry. Then the judge looked down at him. She removed her reading glasses, set them on the desk, and spoke in a voice much gentler than before. "Young man, I want to hear directly from you." The courtroom went silent. Noah swallowed and looked around. He looked at Aunt Maggie, smiling encouragement, and giving a small nod. He looked at Uncle Joey, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, not even trying to hide the tears. He looked at Reed standing by the door, giving a very slight nod, almost invisible, but Noah saw it. And finally, the boy looked at Everett, the man who had knelt in sleet to look him in the eye, the man who had promised no one would hurt him again, the man who had kept that promise. "Can you tell me, in your own words, what you want?" the judge asked. Noah drew a deep breath, his small hand tightening on Buddy, and then he spoke. His voice was small, but clear, carrying through the quiet room. "I want to stay with Mr. Everett," he said. "He makes me feel safe. He sits with me when I have nightmares. He keeps his promises." His voice shook a little, but he kept going. "I've never had a forever. I want to have a forever. Please, ma'am." Silence held. No one in the courtroom dared breathe too loudly. The judge looked at Noah, then at Everett, then down at the file again, for a long time. Then she looked up, and a smile appeared on her stern face. A warm smile from someone who had seen too much tragedy and was now witnessing something good. "The court finds that the petition for adoption is granted," she declared, her voice formal but unable to hide its joy. "As of today, Noah Carter will officially bear the name Noah Ashford, Mr. Everett Ashford is recognized as his father, with all rights and responsibilities under the law." Noah turned to Everett, brown eyes wide, tears beginning to spill down his cheeks. Do I really have a dad now?" Everett dropped to one knee right there in the courtroom, one knee touching the polished wood floor, until his eyes were level with Noah's tear-soaked brown eyes. Like the very first time, on that sleety night, when he'd knelt in front of a barefoot boy shivering outside Obsidian. Like every time he wanted Noah to know they were equal. They were on the same level. They were family. "You really do have a dad now," Everett said, his voice catching, going rough in a way he couldn't control. "Forever. No matter what happens." Noah threw himself into his arms, small arms locking tight around Everett's neck. His face pressed into Everett's shoulder, and the boy cried. But this time the tears were different. Not the fear tears of nightmares. Not the pain tears from when Warren appeared. Not the pleading tears from when he begged not to be sent back. These were tears of joy, of relief, of finally belonging, the tears of a child who had wandered too long and had finally found harbor. The tears of a boy who, for the first time in his life, could say the word forever without fearing it would be ripped from his hands. In Everett's arms, Noah whispered, for the first time, "Dad," one word, one syllable, but heavier than the world, heavier than every multi-million-dollar contract Everett had ever signed, heavier than all the power he held, heavier even than the name Black King that Chicago feared. A small word from the mouth of a 6-year-old, yet strong enough to shatter the wall Everett had built for 18 years. Everett held him tighter, one hand supporting Noah's back, the other shielding the boy's head as if he could protect him from the entire world. Everett's eyes burned, and for the first time in half a lifetime since Jamie died, the Black King felt tears rise. "My son," he whispered back, his voice trembling. "My little boy." Behind them, Maggie was crying, not bothering to hide it, tears running down her stern face. Joey kept wiping his eyes with a white handkerchief, his shoulders shaking in waves. "Doctor," Rachel smiled through her tears. She'd seen many cases in her career, but she'd never witnessed an ending this beautiful. And Reed who had followed Everett for 18 years, Reed who never showed emotion, Reed who was nicknamed The Rock, was turning his face away, pretending to look out the window, but even his shoulders were trembling faintly. Even the judge had to take off her glasses to wipe them, pretending she was adjusting the lenses, but everyone knew what it was. They left the courtroom a little while later, after the tears had dried and everyone had steadied themselves again. When they stepped out of the courthouse, the Chicago sun poured down like a blessing from above, warm, radiant, as if the whole universe were smiling at them. Noah held Everett's hand, his other arm hugging Buddy with the small red bow now a little crooked from being squeezed too tight. The boy looked up, brown eyes bright as stars, as if it was the first time Everett had ever seen real light in them, no longer guarded, no longer afraid, only the pure joy of a child. "Dad?" Noah called, and the word still felt new on his lips, still miraculous each time he said it. "Can we go home?" Home. A word Noah hadn't dared to say for 2 years, a word that had lost its meaning when his birth parents died, a word he'd thought he would never use again. But now the boy had a home, a family, a dad, Uncle Joey and Aunt Maggie, Reed, Obsidian, with its warm kitchen and his own room. Forever. Everett squeezed his son's hand, his larger hand closing around the smaller one, and he smiled, a real smile he'd forgotten how to make long ago. "Yeah, Noah. Let's go home." The black car pulled up in front of Obsidian, and Noah stared through the window with wide, astonished eyes. The restaurant he'd grown used to over the past 3 months looked completely different now. Balloons in every color were tied along both sides of the entrance, shimmering tinsel wrapped around the lampposts, fresh flowers arranged in large vases everywhere. And hanging right in the middle of the big glass doors was an enormous banner with colorful hand lettering. "Welcome home, Noah Ashford." Noah Ashford, his new name, a name with a father inside it. Everett opened the car door, and when Noah stepped down, gripping his dad's hand, the doors of Obsidian swung open. Applause thundered through the air. The whole restaurant was packed, and everyone was clapping, smiling, looking at him with warm, proud eyes. Every employee was there. The servers in their black and white uniforms, the cooks still wearing their aprons, the dishwashers, the bussers, the security staff, all the people who had watched him walk in on that sleety night 3 months ago. Trembling, ragged, terrified, the people who had whispered, "Who is that?" when he crossed the dining room on tiptoe. The people who had slowly grown used to his presence, who had smiled when they saw him laugh, who had panicked when Warren appeared, who had breathed easier when they knew he was safe. Now they stood here, clapping to welcome him back as an official member of the family. Joey stepped out of the crowd, holding a massive cake in both hands. The cake was shaped like a bear, covered in smooth brown frosting, with dark chocolate eyes and a small pink nose. It looked exactly like Buddy. "For my favorite little chef," Joey declared, his voice carrying through the restaurant, his eyes red with tears but his smile bright. "Welcome to the family, Noah Ashford." Noah laughed. Not the small, shy smile from those first weeks, not the cautious grin from when he still wasn't sure he was allowed to laugh, but clear, free laughter, rising from deep in his chest, the laughter of a happy child. Maggie stepped forward, and for the first time since they'd met, she hugged him. The strict arms of the hard-to-please manager were warm and gentle now, holding him tight as if he were her own grandson. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," she whispered into Noah's ear, her voice thick. Reed stood behind them, his face still stern as always, but when Noah looked up, he set a hand on the boy's shoulder and gave a light pat. "You're one of us now, kid." That was all, but coming from Reed, it was a whole speech. Noah looked around the room filled with laughter and light. Looked at all these people, the ones who had given him a chance when he stood barefoot in sleet and asked if anyone wanted to take in a boy. Aunt Maggie with her strict exterior and soft heart, Uncle Joey with his warm smile and morning pancakes, Reed with his silent protection, always there, Doctor, Rachel standing in a corner, smiling, the woman who had healed wounds that weren't only on the skin, and Dad, his real dad, the man who had knelt in the sleet, who had asked his name when no one else wanted to know, who had promised to protect him, and had kept that promise. They cut the cake, Everett guiding Noah's hand, because the knife was too big for the boys. Everyone ate and laughed and talked, trading stories. Someone told the story of the first time Noah spilled batter in the kitchen. Someone else told the story of how he'd spotted a crooked folded napkin. Laughter filled Obsidian, warmer than any elegant party that had ever been thrown there. Noah sat in the middle of it all, Buddy in his lap, with the red bow still intact, a plate of cake in front of him, and for the first time in his life, he understood what family meant. Not the family of blood, but the family of people who choose one another, love one another, protect one another. In the middle of the laughter, Noah tugged gently on Everett's hand, signaling he wanted to say something. Everett leaned down, and the boy whispered, his voice small enough for only the two of them. "Dad, is this real? Will it last?" Everett dropped to one knee, the way he always did, level with his son's eyes, and looked into those brown eyes that still held a trace of worry, a trace of fear that everything might vanish like a dream. "This is real, Noah," he said, his voice certain, "and it's going to last forever." Late at night, the party had ended. The last guests had gone home, and Obsidian returned to its familiar quiet. Only soft lights glowed in the corners, and balloons still tied here and there lingered like traces of the joy that had just passed through. Everett led Noah up to the rooftop balcony, where the whole of Chicago could be seen stretching to the horizon. The city shimmered below, a million lights sparkling like a million stars fallen to earth, tall buildings rising into the night, traffic still moving like rivers of light. Noah sat in Everett's lap, his back against his father's chest, Buddy clutched tight in his arms. The night was cold, wind blowing in from Lake Michigan with a bite of frost, but the boy didn't feel cold. There was a warm blanket wrapped around them. There were his father's arms holding him close. There was the warmth of the man's chest, the man he could call Dad now. "Dad?" Noah spoke, his voice small in the quiet night. "What is it, Noah? That bad man really is gone for good, right?" Everett held his son tighter, his chin resting lightly on the top of the boy's head, the faint scent of children's shampoo rising. "He's gone. He'll never hurt you again. I promise." Silence for a moment, wind moving across the balcony, the city's distant hum rising up, but everything was calm, peaceful. "Dad?" "I love you." 3 words. The first time Noah had said them. 3 small, simple words, but heavier than the world. Everett felt his heart catch, his eyes sting, his throat tighten. 18 years. 18 years since Jamie was gone, since he'd heard his son say Dad one last time, since his heart had frozen and he'd thought it would never thaw. And now, a 6-year-old boy with brown eyes and a battered teddy bear had broken it all open, had melted the ice, had unlocked a door he'd thought he'd sealed forever. "I love you too, Noah," Everett whispered, his voice rough with feeling, "more than anything in this world." Noah yawned, eyelids drooping, his small body relaxing more and more in his father's arms. A long day, heavy with emotion, had drained him. "Dad, can I sleep in your room tonight?" "You can sleep anywhere you want, son. Always." Everett carried Noah into the room, the boy light in his arms, his head against Everett's shoulder, his eyes already half shut. He laid his son on his own bed and pulled the blanket up to the boy's chest. Buddy was placed carefully beside the pillow, the loyal friend who had stayed with Noah through his darkest days, still here now in the happy ones. Noah caught Everett's hand as Everett started to stand, brown eyes opening to look at him. "Can you stay, Dad? Until I fall asleep?" "I'll be here as long as you need." Everett sat down beside the bed, his hand holding his son's, his larger fingers wrapping around the tiny ones. He watched the boy slip slowly into sleep, breathing even, face peaceful. No nightmares, no fear, no curling into a corner. Just a normal child, loved and protected, sleeping in a warm bed with a teddy bear beside him and his father's hand holding tight. The way Jamie should have been allowed to, the way every child in this world deserves to be. Everett sat there a long time, watching his son sleep. And for the first time in 18 years, he felt his heart whole. Outside the window, Chicago was still cold. Sleet might have been falling somewhere in the city, on dark streets, in forgotten corners. There were still children out there shivering in winter nights, wondering if anyone wanted them, listing the things they could do to deserve being loved. But in this room, in the care of the man the whole city called the Black King, one boy had found what he thought he would never have. A home, a family, a father, a forever. "Sir, does anyone want to take in a boy?" That question, spoken in a night of sleet by a barefoot boy standing in front of Obsidian, had finally found its answer. This story reminds us that family isn't always the people we share blood with, but sometimes the people who choose to love one another, choose to stay, choose to protect one another no matter what happens. It reminds us that every child deserves to be loved, deserves a place to call home, deserves to grow up without fear, and it reminds us that sometimes hearts we think are frozen can still melt. Wounds we think will never heal can still be healed, if we dare to open ourselves and give each other a chance. If this story touched your heart, Please take a moment to hit the subscribe button on our channel, tap like, and share this video so we can keep bringing you meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Was there a moment that made you cry? Was there a detail that made you think about real life? Have you ever met someone like Everett? Someone who gave you a chance when no one else did? Or have you ever been that person for someone else? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every comment, and we value every story you share from deep in your heart. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.